Hello everyone, today we start the second book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, titled The Theory of War, and we read and comment on the first chapter of the second book, titled Branches of the Art of War. The text follows. War in its literal meaning is fighting, for fighting alone is the efficient principle in the manifold activity which in a wide sense is called war. But fighting is a trial of strength of the moral and physical forces by means of the latter. That the moral cannot be omitted is evident of itself, for the condition of the mind has always the most decisive influence on the forces employed in war. The necessity of fighting very soon led men to special inventions to turn the advantage in it in their own favor. In consequence of this mode of fighting has undergone great alterations. But in whatever way it is conducted, its conception remains unaltered, and fighting is that which constitutes war. The inventions have been from the first weapons and equipments for the individual combatants. These have to be provided by the use of them learned before the war begins. They are made suitable to the nature of the fighting, consequently are ruled by it. But plainly the activity engaged in these appliances is a different thing from the fight itself. It is only the preparation for the combat, not the conduct of the same. That arming and equipping are not essential to the conception of fighting is plain, because mere wrestling is also fighting. Fighting has determined everything pertaining to arms and equipment, and these in turn modify the mode of fighting. There is, therefore, a reciprocity of action between the two. Nevertheless, the fight itself remains still an entirely special activity, more particularly because it moves in an entirely special element, namely in the element of danger. If, then, there is anywhere a necessity for drawing a line between two different activities, it is here, and in order to see clearly the importance of this idea, we need only just to call to mind how often eminent personal fitness in one field has turned out nothing but the most useful pedantry in the other. It is also in no way difficult to separate in idea the one activity from the other, if we look at the combatant forces fully armed and equipped as a given means, the profitable use of which requires nothing more than a knowledge of their general results. The art of war is therefore, in its proper sense, the art of making use of the given means in fighting, and we cannot give it a better name than the conduct of war. On the other hand, in a wider sense, all activities which have their existence on account of war, therefore the whole creation of troops, that is, levying them, arming, equipping, and exercising them, belong to the art of war. To make a sound theory, it is most essential to separate these two activities, for it is easy to see that if every act of war is to begin with the preparation of military forces, and to presuppose forces so organized as a primary condition for conducting war, that theory will only be applicable in the few cases to which the force available happens to be exactly suited. If, on the other hand, we wish to have a theory which shall suit most cases, and will not be wholly useless in any case, it must be founded on those means which are in most general use, and in respect to this only on the actual results springing from them. The conduct of war is, therefore, the formation and conduct of the fighting. It is, if this fighting was a single act, there would be no necessity for any further subdivision, but the fight is composed of a greater or less number of single acts, complete in themselves, which we call combats, as we have shown in the first chapter of the first book, and which form new units. From this arises the totally different activities that of the formation and conduct of these single combats in themselves, and the combination of them with one another, with a view to the ultimate object of the war. The first is called tactics, the other strategy. The division into tactics and strategy is now in almost general use, and everyone knows tolerably well under which head to place any single fact, without knowing very distinctly the grounds on which the classification is founded. But when such divisions are blindly adhered to in practice, they must have some deep root. We have searched for this root, and we might say that it is just the usage of the majority which has brought us to it. On the other hand, we look upon the arbitrary, unnatural definitions of these conceptions sought to be established by some writers as not in accordance with the general usage of the terms. According to our classification, therefore, tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat. Strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war. The way in which the conception of a single or independent combat is more closely determined, the conditions to which this unit is attached, we shall only be able to explain clearly when we consider the combat. We must content ourselves for the present with saying that in relation to space, therefore in combats taking place at the same time, the unit reaches just as far as personal command reaches, but in regard to time, and therefore in relation to combats which follow each other in close succession, it reaches to the moment when the crisis which takes place in every combat is entirely past. That doubtful cases may occur, cases for instance in which the several combats may perhaps be regarded also as a single one, will not overthrow the ground of distinction we have adopted, for the same is the case with all grounds of distinction of real things which are differentiated by a gradual diminishing scale. Therefore, there may therefore certainly be acts of activity in war which, without any alteration in the point of view, may just as well be counted strategic as tactical. For example, very extended positions resembling a chain of posts, the preparation for the passage of a river at several points, etc. Our classification reaches and covers only the use of the military force. But now there are in war a number of activities which are subservient to it and still are quite different from it. Sometimes closely allied, sometimes less near in their affinity. All these activities relate to the maintenance of the military force. In the same way as its creation and training precede its use, so its maintenance is always a necessary condition. But, strictly viewed, all activities thus connected with it are always to be regarded only as preparations for fighting. They are certainly nothing more than the activities which are very close to the action, so that they run through the hostile act, alternate in importance with the use of the forces. We have therefore a right to exclude them, as well as the other preparatory activities, from the art of war in its restricted sense, from the conduct of war properly so called, and we are obliged to do so if we would comply with the first principle of all theory, the elimination of all heterogeneous elements. We would include in the real conduct of war the whole litany of subsistence and administration, because it is admitted to stand in constant reciprocal action with the use of the troops, but is something essentially different from it. We have said in the third chapter of our first book that as the fight or combat is the only directly effective activity, therefore the threads of all others, as they end in it, are included in it. But by this we meant to say that to all others an object was thereby appointed which, in accordance with the laws peculiar to themselves, they must seek to attain. Here we must go a little closer into this subject. The subject which constitute the activities outside of the combat are of various kinds. The one part belongs, in one respect, to the combat itself, is identical with it, whilst it serves in another respect for the maintenance of the military force. The other part belongs purely to the subsistence, and has only, in consequence of the reciprocal action, a limited influence on the combats by its results. The subjects which, in one respect, belong to the fighting itself are marches, camps, and cantonments, for they suppose so many different situations of troops, and where troops are supposed there the idea of combat must always be present. The other subjects which only belong to the maintenance are subsistence, care of the sick, the supply and repair of arms and equipment. Marches are quite identical with the use of the troops. The act of marching in the combat, generally called maneuvering, certainly does not necessarily include the use of weapons, but it is so completely and necessarily combined with it that it forms an integral part of that which we call a combat. But the march outside the combat is nothing but the execution of a strategic measure. By the strategic plan is settled when, where, and with what forces a battle is to be delivered, and to carry that into execution the march is the only means. The march outside of the combat is therefore an instrument of strategy, but not on that account exclusively a subject of strategy, for as the armed force which executes it may be involved in a possible combat at any moment, therefore its execution stands also under tactical as well as strategic rules. If we prescribe to a column its route on a particular side of a river or of a branch of a mountain, then that is a strategic measure, for it contains the intention of fighting on that particular side of the hill or river in preference to the other, in case a combat should be necessary during the march. But if a column, instead of following the road through a valley, marches along the parallel ridge of heights, or for the convenience of marching divides itself into several columns, then these are tactical arrangements, for they relate to the manner in which we shall use the troops in the anticipated combat. The particular order of march is in constant relation with readiness for combat, is therefore tactical in its nature, for it's nothing more than the first or preliminary disposition for the battle which may possibly take place. As the march is the instrument by which strategy apportions its active elements, the combats, but these last often only appear by the result and not in the details of their real course, it could not fail to happen that in theory the instrument has often been substituted for the efficient principle. Thus we hear of a decisive skilful march, allusion being thereby made to those combat combinations to which these marches led. This substitution of ideas is too natural and conciseness of expression too desirable to call for alteration, but still it is only a condensed chain of ideas in regard to which we must never omit to bear in mind the full meaning, if we would avoid falling into error. We fall into error of this description if we attribute to strategical combination a power independent on tactical results. We read of marches and maneuvers combined, the object attained, and at the same time not a word about combat, from which the conclusion is drawn that there are means in war of conquering an enemy without fighting. The prolific nature of this error we cannot show until hereafter. But although a march can be regarded absolutely as an integral part of the combat, still there are in it certain relations which do not belong to the combat, and therefore are neither tactical nor strategic. To these belong all arrangements which concern only the accommodation of the troops, the construction of bridges, roads, etc. These are only conditions. Under many circumstances, they are in very close connection and may almost identify themselves with the troops, as in building a bridge in presence of the enemy. But in themselves they are always activities, the theory of which does not form part of the theory of the conduct of war. So, very long passage, but definitely worth it and conceptually enucleated. So, von Clausewitz here remembers us that war is, in its literal meaning, fighting, right? Because fighting alone he writes, is the efficient principle in the manifold activity which, in a wide sense, is called war. This is really the efficient principle. It's the one that makes effectively war going on. He writes then, but when fighting is a trial of strength, of the moral and physical forces by means of the latter, right? So he also adds that the moral cannot be omitted is even of itself, for the condition of the mind has always the most decisive influence on the forces employed in war. So he's telling us that the fighting occurs by the means of physical forces, basically. But as we have seen in the first book quite extensively, these are always related to the moral ones, right? So we can be more or less strong, physically speaking, in terms of men and material, etc. But still, a large part of what war is about is also moral resources, and the two spheres, moral and physical, are always in a reciprocal relation. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the necessity of fighting very soon led men to special inventions to turn the advantage in it in their own favor. In consequence of these, mode of fighting has undergone great alterations, but in whatever way it is conducted, its conception remains unaltered, and fighting is that which constitutes war, right? So here von Clausewitz reflects on the fact that our civilization transforms. It somewhat evolves at this point, meaning that it also became more complex, more complicated. This has altered naturally the difficulty even of solving the fight. But the fight in itself actually remains unaltered as such. This is a very important concept in Clausewitzian theory, because it focuses on the kind of a universal nature of war as a human activity, basically never changes. Not because weapons never change or tactics never change as a consequence, but because the fighting is conceptually the thing that remains always there in the same exact way. Then how it's carried out by different means, this special inventions he talks about, is under everybody's eyes. Just thinking how warfare evolved in last century, for example. But this doesn't invalidate in any way the concept of fighting that von Clausewitz described, right? So I don't digress in this, but you know what I think about it, right? So do not think it's easy or even plausible to criticize von Clausewitz in this sense. Do not trust culturalists or other deniers of the validity of the Clausewitzian theory, because they're wrong. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the inventions have been from the first weapons and equipments for the individual combatants, right? These have to be provided and the use of them learned before the war begins, right? This is particularly important because it has to do with the concept of doctrine that we will deal with on another occasion at this point. But it's still very important because basically you have to educate, you have to train in order to use this kind of special this weapons and equipments in order to make them work effectively. It doesn't take to have the best weapon and equipment only to win a war. As a matter of fact, that is always insufficient. What it really takes is to know how to use them effectively, right? So always remember, technology is nothing, doctrine is everything. This is a principle you can easily sculpt into your mind, because that's really what war is in a nutshell, in the way it's fought. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says they are these invention of weapons and equipments are made suitable to the nature of the fighting, consequently are ruled by it. But plainly, the activity engaged in these appliances is a different thing from the fight itself. It is only the preparation for the combat, not the conduct of the same, right? So here von Clausewitz highlights essentially two aspects. The first one is that it's objectively weapons and equipments that are suited to the nature of fighting. Like, many people believe that fundamentally technologies change tactics, but fundamentally it's mostly the other way around. I mean, as we will see now, there is always a reciprocity between these two things, because certain technologies do make a difference, but still it's the political and social preconditions that basically produce those technologies that can give some edge depending on, on certain situations, but they're not really what make tactics. It's tactics that make weapons, not the other way around, by overwhelming edge. The other concept is that still the preparation for combat is in fact only the preparation for it. The conduct of combat is different, right? They're two different things, right? And we've seen actually in the very last video at the end of the first book how this basically intervenes. I mean, the difference that exists between training and experience, right? Albeit there is a kind of a middle ground where they meet, but still conceptually, when you prepare for combat and then when you actually conduct the same, they're two really different things. Then von Clausewitz writes that arming and equipping are not essential to the conception of fighting is plain because mere wrestling is also fighting. Naturally, this is particularly important. It partly uses to understand what we were saying before about doctrine. I mean, arming and equipping is not really fighting, right? It is not. And what von Clausewitz is saying here is basically you can fight even when you are without weapons, or at least, even if you're not. In fact, enmity remains, right? You can aggress another human even if you're not armed or prepared for it. And that's the point of the story. That's what combat is at the end of the day. So arming and equipping is something that stays aside from this. Then von Clausewitz writes, fighting has determined everything pertaining to arms and equipment, and these in turn modify the mode of fighting. There is therefore a reciprocity of action between the two, which we were mentioning before, right? So fighting has determined everything pertaining to arms and equipment, but these in turn have an influence on the mode of fighting, right? This is particularly important to bear in mind, because it's as if technology had, it's not as if technology really has certain conditions under which it can be applicated, basically. Those conditions are much more, are much deeper and wider, more and structural, so that you can have, machine guns before World War II obliging to turn warfare from kind of mobile to trench warfare, basically, right? But that's still not a product of a machine gun put out there without any, any context. That context that produced the machine gun, that applied in that specific context, brings the trench warfare. And the proof is that these things changed, and that the technology, in this sense, doesn't dictate the thing, is that we went past trench warfare. Sure, because of technology, but also because of new transformations that occurred into politics, society, economics, and so on, right? In science in general. So something that really goes far beyond what happens, strictly speaking, on the battlefield. Think about nuclear weapons and all the technology behind it. And also the dilemma of, working at atomic engineering, let's say, knowing that can bring to the creation of nuclear weapons. There were a big deal of conscience scruples in certain occasions because of this. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, nevertheless, the fight itself remains still an entirely special activity, more particularly because it moves in an entirely special element, namely in the element of danger. So here danger comes back, and basically, von Clausewitz tells us that it's informing combat, right? Probably that's the most fundamental, the most determinant element in here. The idea that everything you do in war is inherently dangerous, and by far, because every action you have to take is like a step, not into complete darkness, but as we have seen, like a 3/4 of darkness. That's how von Clausewitz puts it, really. So this changes a lot, because basically everything, just take technology, you can't test technology. That's why doctrine is so important, by the way. You can test technology in a completely, but even in training, right? Think about the accuracy of fire, right? During training, fire accuracy is pretty damn good. In combat, it basically decreases radically. And that's normal. So that has nothing to, and that happens because there are certain situations that are dominated by danger that bring to that poor use even of technology. That's when doctrine enters into play, because at that point you don't just need the technology, but also you need to use it effectively. So you need also in there an extra training and some other elements to take into consideration. And still, well, that's an example of technology also at an individual level, but I mean, it's something that goes way far beyond technology. So never fall into the trap. Always remember, technology alone, it's nothing. Doctrine is everything. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, if, then, there is anywhere a necessity for drawing a line between two different activities, it is here. And in order to see clearly the importance of this idea, we need only just to call to mind how often eminent personal fitness in one field has turned out nothing but the most useless pedantry in the other, right? And this can reflect, in this sense, in, a lot of planning and preparation, ultimately for no ability of performing, of fighting at the end of the day. So that's where probably one of the most crucial difficulties comes for who doesn't know war in its essence, is understanding that what happens in war doesn't correspond to largely to rational conduct, because this is constantly tormented by so many factors that that intervene to disrupt this, and therefore you can have the best equipment, you can receive the best training, you can even have an overwhelming hedge by certain things, but things can always go dramatically wrong, seriously wrong, unexpectedly wrong, right? And von Clausewitz then goes on and says, it is also in no way difficult to separate in idea the one activity from the other if we look at the combatant forces fully armed and equipped as a given means, the profitable use of which requires nothing more than a knowledge of their general results. So here he also starts distinguishing how also we create doctrine fundamentally. This has to do, in fact, not with what we expect to happen, but what factually happens. This is particularly important because von Clausewitz will write at one point in the Vom Kriege that the theory of war and the doctrine are those fields of theory in human activity that mostly draw from experience, right? So it's as if the art of war was in fact based largely on exercise, but when it comes to theory, the theory is fed by that exercise largely, overwhelmingly, right? So, and that's a very pragmatic idea, because it doesn't here, well, we're not arrived at at that chapter that I remember yet, but still, this has to do with how it's an let's say an economical dynamic, right? In other words, it's much more convenient to simply try directly than speculating about it in order to have to earn knowledge. And we're kind of lucky enough under a certain perspective, because we have done a lot of war throughout all history, so we kind of have an overwhelming amount of material on which studying how war works. And that's why military history is so vital for the art of war as well, because we can't ignore the results, right? We obviously, everything goes differently, so this doesn't mean that you can look at history and fundamentally being able to assess magically what's going on in your specific condition, but that can help you in what is more or less likely to happen in the measure, however, in which you have to deal with it. That is way more complicated. This doesn't really help you to gain better knowledge. I mean, there is still a huge amount of effort you have to do, and that most of the times you don't have the opportunity to, in order to solve the situation. So it's that difficult. And for Clausewitz writes, in fact, here that the art of war is therefore, in its proper sense, the art of making use of the given means in fighting, and we cannot give it a better name than the conduct of war. Right? So the art of war is effectively, that's why it's an art and not a science, because it mostly derives its nature from, its character from gained experience. So it has to do how you lead war, you wage war, you conduct war proper. For Clausewitz goes on and says, on the other hand, in a wider sense, all activities which have their existence on account of war, therefore the whole creation of troops, that is, levying them, arming, equipping, and exercising them, belong to the art of war, right? So these activities are comprehended by the art of war. Very important to remember. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, to make a sound theory, it is most essential to separate these two activities, for it is easy to see that if every act of war is to begin with the preparation of military forces and to presuppose forces so organized as a primary condition for conducted war, the theory will only be applicable in the few cases to which the force available happens to be exactly suited. So in other words, von Clausewitz saying, if we were to if we were to connect these two activities, like theory and conduct, on the base of just how suited our troops are fundamentally to that specific theater, let's assume, this theory would practically have to take into contemplation, just pedantly speaking, only those situations and waiting for them to appear in some ways. So instead he goes on and says, if on the other hand we wish to have a theory which shall suit most cases and will not be wholly useless in any case, however, it must be founded on those means which are in most general use, and in respect to these only on the actual results springing from them. So in other words, what you really need instead is a theory that has still a general applicability, but that is not so general at the point that it's of no practical use. He'll also always remember that von Clausewitz is interested in pragmatic stuff. He doesn't care about abstractions, right? He's not content with something that doesn't have a purpose that can make really a difference in war, right? So he says, in order to start with a theory that we can apply at this point in every condition, so that we don't have to wait or to try to foresee whatever can happen, because also we have seen in the first book that it's basically impossible, and every situation is different, we should look essentially at the results, right? that the employment of means have from experience, right? From the most general use. So this will not naturally tell us what to do in every single situation, and basically there can't be a theory functioning like that. But we should look at the general in observing what we need in most moments, right? And this is in a nutshell what military history gives us, right? There is no other way unless actually leading an army, so kind of making and observing military history from its real conduct. So always bear in mind that in this sense experience, however, first-hand experience is much better than just theoretical experience, but still practical experience has to fit itself of what we already know about what happens in real war, what happened in the real wars, in order to be a good artist of war. Let's put it in this way. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, the conduct of war is therefore the formation and conduct of the fighting. If this fighting was a single act, so before I said something like that, the formation and conduct are two separated things. Instead, the conduct of war is, it was right in this sense. In fact, he repeats more clearly, says, the conduct of war is therefore the formation and conduct of the fighting, right? So do not let's say, think that the conduct of war and the conduct of the fighting are two different things, right? Because the conduct of war contains the formation and the conduct of the fighting. So, von Clausewitz writes, if this fighting was a single act, right, so something that basically exhausted itself in just one shot, there would be no necessity for any further subdivision. But the fight is composed of a greater or less number of single acts, complete in themselves, which we call combats, as we have shown in the first chapter of the first book. Always remember that if you need to look at that, I've made the entire list up to this point, so you can look at the first chapter, first book in playlist I created. And combat does form new units in this sense. So basically combats are different units in the conduct of war, have to do with combat proper that, however, in this sense generate others. So here it's a bit complicated in how it evolves, but in this sense it's as complicated as war goes. It's as complex, then it's complicated to understand it. So this is a problem for which nobody can give you a solution at the end of the day. But always bearing in mind that these units that are of combats are make this several acts which war is composed by. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, from this arises the totally different activities that of the formation and conduct of these single combats in themselves, and the combination of them with one another with a view to the ultimate object of the war, right? So basically he says that, if combat was just two abstract entities that exhaust themselves against each other, there wouldn't be no differentiation. But we've seen how during the first book, how fundamentally most of the conduct of war is devoid of actual combat, but there is all a preparation for it. So the formation and conduct of the single combats bring to a set of combinations you have to play with in order to the ultimate object of war, which is to overthrow your enemy and to compel him to fulfill your will. So the first one is called tactics, the other strategy, right? So, in other words, now von Clausewitz will give us the right definition, right? But tactics solve the single combat. Strategy is about combining the various combats in order to win the war. So this division in tactics and strategy von Clausewitz writes is now in almost general use, and everyone knows tolerably well under which head to place any single fact without knowing very distinctly the grounds on which the classification is founded. But when such divisions are blindly adhered to in practice, they must have some deep root. We have searched for this root, and we might say that it is just the usage of the majority which has brought us to it. On the other hand, we look upon the arbitrary, unnatural definitions of these conceptions sought to be established by some writers as not in accordance with the general usage of the terms. So here, von Clausewitz is preparing for the definition of tactics and strategy that now we read in the next paragraph. And he's observing, though, an interesting thing is that fundamentally it's pretty easy to understand the difference between tactics and strategy, right? It is true. I think the average person kind of still messes them up. Strategy in this sense is usually applied very often in the place of tactics, while I rather, well, yeah, sometimes even there is also the vice versa, let's say, but strategy is more universal sometimes. Instead, they are two very different things in this practical sense, and they do influence each other, but still they're fairly easy to understand. So von Clausewitz was writing already at the time, saying, more or less everybody knows tolerably well the difference between strategy and tactics and strategy. So here the concept is, just keep it in mind, if you have it. And here he gives us the definition. It's otherwise very simple and very clear, right? There is not very, I don't know if you ever thought about it. What's the definition of tactics? What's the definition of strategy? Something extremely complicated. No, it's very, very simple. Given that they have to be framed into a theory of war that von Clausewitz makes rather complex. But the definition is otherwise very, very easy. And in fact, von Clausewitz gives us this classification, very simple. Tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat. Strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war. So I repeat it because it's very important. Tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat. Strategy is the theory of the use of combat for the object of the war. Right? So in other words, tactics serve to solve combat, battles if you prefer. Strategy instead of the theory of how to use your forces in order to arrive to combat, right? For the object of the war. That's the point. I repeat it a third time so that we go without doubts on this. Tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat. Strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war. Clear, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says, the way in which the conception of a single or independent combat is more closely determined, the conditions to which this unit is attached, we shall only be able to explain clearly when we consider the combat. So, for now, we skip it. And he says, we must content ourselves, for the present, with saying that in relation to space, therefore in combats taking place at the same time, the unit reaches just as far as personal command reaches. Right? But in regard to time, and therefore in relation to combats which follow each other in close succession, it reaches to the moment when the crisis which takes place in every combat is entirely past. Right? So, in relation to space, it's really a matter of who is in command. And in matter of time, what matters this is all to define the unit of combat is when basically here this crisis is entirely past. It is when the combat is practically over. So that's how it's defined. It's by personal command and how much the combat lasts. So that's how you can identify the unit of combat as such. And actually, as von Clausewitz also will explain us now, these units are part of something. I mean, there are groups of other elements, right? And several combat units, better units of combat, can work together in a larger unit in this sense. So now we will see how it can be perceived in decreasing levels, but it's important to be able to identify the units of combat individually from a conceptual point of view. I mean, a battle, for example, is the best example. You can more or less distinguish when a battle begins and ends, right? It's always approximated in some sense, but it's pretty evident in some way. It's much more complicated when it's saying when does really a war start. I mean, maybe not from an operational point of view, but whether to understand when does the intention of the use of combat for the object of war really starts, also as a theory, right? While combats are something relatively well identifiable in the broader spectrum of the operations, because they are also they tend to exhaust themselves quickly, and there are a lot of moments instead of suspension of action which make up the majority of war, right? And von Clausewitz writes, in that doubtful cases may occur cases, for instance, in which several combats may perhaps be regarded also as a single one, will not overthrow the ground of distinction we have adopted, for the same is the case with all grounds of distinction of real things which are differentiated by a gradually diminishing scale, right? So this is pretty obvious. And there are certain operations that can that always involve, I would say, certain units of combat that also can be interpreted in between tactics and strategy. In fact, here von Clausewitz makes an example, says, there may therefore certainly be acts of activity in war which, without any alteration in the point of view, may just as well be counted strategic as tactical. For example, very extended positions resembling a chain of posts, the preparations for the passage of a river at several points, etc. So these are obvious examples of how, yeah, you can have such a large army that deploying it along a line can look like kind of a strategic move rather than just thinking about what an armored corps can do, or like in this sense, or even crossing a river does have a strategical relevance. In any case, we can say that strategy and tactics are mutually interfering on each other all the time. Like every tactical action has an impact on strategy. Every strategical action has an impact on tactics. It always happens like this, but still we differentiate them, right? And still we can have a battle, for example, where there are several combats happening here and there, so that you can basically isolate them and saying these are units of combat on their own. Like we can just think about all the battles we described on Schwerpunkt. There are several phases in which different units are involved on different parts of the battlefield. Well, this is the same identical concept, but you can still see that battle as a whole, as a combat unit of combat at large, by approximating, saying that of course there were these smaller units of combat that made it up, but still it's it can be identified as such, for example, in a broader strategical theater, right? So it may sound complicated, but it's actually very simple, conceptually speaking. You don't have to, it's as if you had this zoom that you can use back and forth, right? And therefore, the more you approach, the larger the scale is, and the less you see from the smaller units. And instead, the smaller it is, the more you can look at the various smaller units. So it's that simple, right? And it passes through the ranks. It passes through the organic. You can start conceiving for like a squad action to a divisional action and more. Like, right? They're all kind of contain themselves, and that's the same logic of organics, right? Yes. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, our classification reaches and covers only the use of the military force. So here we're talking just about the military force proper, the one that actually fights. But now, von Clausewitz goes on, says, but now there are in war a number of activities which are subservient to it, and still are quite different from it. Sometimes closely allied, sometimes less near in their affinity. All these activities relate to the maintenance of the military force. In other words, there are certain activities that are not strictly military, but they're necessary in order to maintain your military instrument fit, right? It's important, and it's a bit like oil in engines, right? The oil naturally has its own mass and energy, and it's consumed by the same engine, but it kind of fluidifies in this sense part of the friction, right? Of the attrition, so it makes the machine going on, the engine going on, and performing better its own task. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, in the same way as its creation and training precede its use, so its maintenance is always a necessary condition, right? So this is important because von Clausewitz is equating the importance of the creation of the military instrument and its training to its maintenance, which is obvious. You can't train and equip an armed force and then send it out there without supplies, for example. I mean, it's self-evident that it wouldn't work. So it's as vital as that. Von Clausewitz adds then, but strictly viewed, all activities thus connected with it are always to be regarded only as preparations for fighting. They are certainly nothing more than activities which are very close to the action, so that they run through the hostile act, alternate in importance with the use of the forces. So they're kind of always there as well. Also in here you can't really distinguish the moment in which a unit gets resupplied. Preferably it happens between a fighter and another, but it can happen during the same fight. So, but it's always there. Here it's not meant nor physically nor temporally detached, but conceptually detached, because they're still two different things. And now we'll take a better look at them. As von Clausewitz says, there are certainly nothing more than activities which, we have already read it. He says, we have therefore a right to exclude them, as well as the other preparatory activities, from the art of war in its restricted sense, from the conduct of war properly so called, right? And because we have distinguished it before, that the art of war contains the preparation and the conduct of war. So this has to do with these activities the maintenance has to do with the preparation of what the conduct of war properly called, right? And he says, and we are obliged to do so if we would comply with the first principle of all theory, the elimination of all heterogeneous elements, because that's the obvious aim of theory, is to distinguish them theoretically right? It doesn't mean that in practice they do not meet, they don't intersect, they don't have a relation in each other, but they are still conceptually different. It's very important to make clarity here, because that's really how you can understand war, because otherwise you put everything together and you can't distinguish anything. You simply say, well, war is a mess, point, end of the story. Well, no. Here Von Clausewitz is doing a pretty amazing, outstanding job in outlining very clearly, very precisely, and correctly all these theoretical elements. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, "Who would include in the real conduct of war the whole litany of subsistence and administration, because it is admitted to stand in constant reciprocal action with the use of the troops, but it's something essentially different from it, right? So who does contain in the conduct of war literally, things like all the logistics and administration that are, say, off the it's not about that, right? Now we'll see how certain operations and maneuvers have to do with it, so they can conceived as closer to it, but they're still separated in a broader picture. And and that's the reason why, for example, there are excellent commanders that are poor administrators, and yes, it's very happy convenience when good commanders are also good administrators. Take, for example, Scipio or Hannibal, were both of them. Especially Hannibal, as an administrator, he also understood much of civilian life, and given that, according to the Clausewitzian Trinity, these all kind of go together. So here we're talking about things that pertain strictly to the military side of the story. So with this rhetorical question, we pass on. And Von Clausewitz writes, "We said in the third chapter of our first book that as the fight or combat is the only directly effective activity, therefore the threads of all others, as they end it, are included in it." By this, he explains, we meant to say that to all others an object was thereby appointed which, in accordance with the laws peculiar to themselves, they must seek to attain. Here we must go a little closer into this subject, right? So if I understood it correctly, this means that, in that chapter, basically, Von Clausewitz tells that still combat is at the center of everything, so that not just all combats are somehow related practically, but also everything revolving around them. So not even strictly all the military aspects of the story are related to combat, right? This is particularly important. So here he talks a bit more about it and says, the subjects of which constitute the activities outside the combat are of various kinds, right? So let's give a look at them. So he says, the one part belongs, in one respect, to the combat itself, is identical with it, whilst it serves in another respect for the maintenance of the military force. The other part belongs purely to the subsistence, and has only, in consequence of the reciprocal action, a limited influence on the combats by its results. And it says, he explains which these two types are. The subjects which in one respect belong to the fighting itself are marches, camps, and cantonments, for they suppose so many different situations of troops, and where troops are supposed there, the idea of combat must always be present. The other subjects which only belong to the maintenance are subsistence, care of the sick, the supply and repair of arms and equipment. And this is a very important distinction, because basically there is one part that is, Von Clausewitz calls identical to combat in itself, because basically it pertains to the troops proper, so the combat agents, fundamentally the fighters. So these are marches, camps, and cantonments. So these have to do with the way effectively troops are able to deliver their force, and to fight, and they have really a very strong territorial routing. Like marches, camps, and cantonments, as you understand here, are very material-oriented things. They serve to move through space and to maintain yourself through space. I mean, not to maintain, but to stay in one place. Then the second group pertains to the substance, purely to the subsistence, which basically is fundamental for those troops to preserve themselves, but they do not influence as such combat as such, meaning that they obviously influence combat because you can in fact aid the troops, taking care of them, they're wounded or sick, and to supply and repair arms or equipment, but all these aspects do not influence how eventually the military instrument will be used, how its force will be delivered properly. Because even if you are supplied or healed or rearmed, etc., still this doesn't tell us what if you're going to be capable to fight anyway, if you're gonna make the right decision or not, right? This is very important. But this, as you understand, if you take them separately from a conceptual point of view, they all make sense. But in reality, they're evidently intertwined. So you can have combat medics under fire that are also combatants themselves, for instance. But there are still two different moments, right? Not necessarily nor in time or space, but they're conceptually separated. And von Clausewitz explains this a little better by saying marches are quite identical with the use of the troops. The act of marching into combat, generally called maneuvering, or evolution if you want, certainly does not necessarily include the use of weapons, but it is so completely and necessarily combined with it that it forms an integral part of that which we call combat. Now this is pretty obvious, right? Moving is not fighting, but you can you can't deliver force if you don't maneuver in this sense. So it's particularly important to understand how this is part of combat in itself. It's literally how combat is delivered, and we know very well how collective training is fundamentally the most important thing in combat in terms of being able to perform tactics. So it says marching in itself doesn't include the use of weapons because it's just marching, sticking together, but at the same time it's subordinated to the same use of weapons, as you understand, because that's going to happen, right? So that it's so necessarily combined, so completely and necessarily combined with it, that it forms an integral part of that which we call a combat. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, but the march outside the camp is nothing but the execution of a strategic measure. It's obvious, right? So, in fact, he adds, by the strategic plan is settled when, where, and with what forces the battle is to be delivered, and to carry that into execution, the march is only the means, right? So, to take the extremis of this, if there is a formation and makes an evolution in the battlefield in order to attack the enemy in some place of its own line, that is strictly connected with combat. But if you're talking about marching through, hundreds of miles, because you have to reach one place where eventually you have to fight, right? Think about Napoleon's march through the Black Forest and all what that entailed in really about the combat that had to occur at the Battle of Ulm, and how that is strategical. And then in the broader picture, in the narrower picture during battle, that it was necessary to march to attack, getting out of the woods and attacking the Austrians where they didn't expect it. So this is a good example. So it makes you understand better what's the difference between tactics and strategy, right? And von Clausewitz goes on and says, the march outside of the combat is therefore an instrument of strategy, but not on that account exclusively a subject of strategy, for as the armed force which executes it may be involved in a possible combat at any moment, therefore its execution stands also under tactical as well as strategic rules. Now this is obvious, like marches are never basically devoid of the idea that you can be under attack, right? There are various orders of march. So, famously enough, there are marches for in asset fighting. There are others that are instead really for marching through a friendly territory where you don't need, but still this does influence how you perform that. So it's so strategical as tactical in this sense at the same time, right? And von Clausewitz goes on and says, if we prescribe to a column its route on a particular side of a river or of a branch of a mountain, then that is a strategic measure, for it contains the intention of fighting on that particular side of the hill, or there even in preference to the other, in case a combat should be necessary during the march. So this is particularly important because it really makes you understand what strategy is at this point. Is really moving that unit into a place where you can expect there will be a combat. So at that point, the march is in itself both a strategical movement, but also tactical one, in the measure in which you can think, for example, I don't know if that slope is particularly favorable, where the fight is going to take place on there. What is better for you in that tactical situation, not in its rather strategical one. So these elements compenetrate each other and are always present, right? And in fact, here von Clausewitz adds, for tactical side, the particular order of march is in constant relation with the readiness for combat, is therefore tactical in its nature, for it is nothing more than the first or preliminary disposition for the battle which may possibly take place, right? A column in march has this dramatic task of forming up in battle line of battle, for being able to fight, and that can make a lot of difference, because column formation is not meant for fighting, at least most of the times, yet it's fundamentally capable of changing formation and to bringing the fight in that place. I mean, the column has this evident advantage of being narrower, so having a shorter front that can go through even kind of a narrow paths, and simply the guys behind you following, that can increase the speed and the effectiveness. You can get into one place in order to fight, but in this sense, it goes to one place in order to fight. That's the point. So in the anticipation of a combat. And then von Clausewitz writes, the particular order of march is in constant relation with the readiness for combat, is therefore tactical in its nature, for it's nothing more than the first or preliminary disposition for the battle which may possibly take place. And we have seen it now. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, as the march is the instrument by which strategy apportions its active elements, the combats, but these last often only appear by their results and not in the details of their real course, it could not fail to happen that in theory the instrument has often been substituted for the efficient principle. Thus we hear of a decisive skillful march, allusion being thereby made to those combat combinations to which these marches led. This substitution of ideas is too natural and conciseness of expression too desirable to call for alteration, but still it is only a condensed chain of ideas in regard to which we must never omit to bear in mind the full meaning if we would avoid falling into error, right? So there is always basically both the strategical and tactical side that influence each other, and in order to assess what is going on fundamentally, you have to take into consideration, in fact, the combination of the various units of combat, so that you can know how they interact and how you. I mean, if you're from that side to cope with them, but also at the same time to if the enemy is performing that same maneuver, understanding why he's doing it for. So it develops always on a sort of bidimensional side level, excuse me, that has to shape your mind in this different dimensions. And in fact, von Clausewitz here writes something very meaningful. We fall into an error of this description if we attribute to strategical combinations of power independent of tactical results. You can't read it like that, because strategical combinations are all aimed by definition to combat, to perform combat. Von Clausewitz writes, we read of marches and maneuvers combined, the object attained, and at the same time not a word about combat, from which the conclusion is drawn that there are means in war of conquering an enemy without fighting. Right? The prolific nature of this error we cannot show until hereafter. And here there is a really powerful concept beyond this, because von Clausewitz is, as you know, is really concerned with the effectiveness of his theory, but at the same time the kind of criticizing those who in fact write errors in this sense, by saying, you know, marches should always be carried out in this way, and not taking into consideration the fact that there is a combat from the other side. So concentrating on the strategic nature of marches, excluding marches are just an example. There are many things in this sense, excluding the tactical side of the story. Right? Like that's an example that works better with the kind of combat medic. For instance, the idea that, you know, a medic has two very different jobs if he's on the front line under fire, or, you know, kind of couple of miles, let's say of tens of miles behind the front, receiving the wounded from the front. So that's the same thing, and they cannot be excluded in any case, because you have at that point to adapt everything on the base of those properly of these expectations, because that's what they are at the end of the day. And in fact here he brings to the paradox, saying from such examples, he says we would have to, you know, to think that the conclusion is drawn that there are means in war of conquering an enemy without fighting. As if, you know, it was sufficient to march in one place without thinking to ever combat. Naturally, sometimes it does happen. Sometimes there are invasions in which there is virtually no fighting involved, but the fighting in here is broadly meant. Like, it's you maybe just annihilating the enemy that does make a certain activity resistance anyway, and even if it was so, if you don't have troops that are trained for war, you don't have effectively anything you can fight with. So that's the very mistake. And for Clausewitz says we will read this better on another occasion from this point of view. And he says excuse me, I was thinking here about the fact that we'll have to cut in a certain way the various chapters because they're kind of divided, whatever. We will end the chapter next time. But, okay. And Von Clausewitz then writes, but although a march can be regarded absolutely as an integral part of the combat, still there are in it certain relations which do not belong to the combat, and therefore neither tactical nor strategic. To these belong all arrangements which concern only the accommodation of the troops, the construction of bridges, roads, etc. These are only conditions. Under many circumstances they are in very close connection and may almost identify themselves with the troops, as in building a bridge in the presence of the enemy. But in themselves they are always activities, theory which does not form part of the theory of the conduct of war. Right? And here it's particularly important to understand that there are certain things that seem to fall into the broader tactical and strategic field, but they are really not, because they do not have to do with combat proper, like the accommodation of the troops, something that a logist has to think about. The construction of bridges and roads, like engineers that we call military engineers because they are attached to combat forces, but in that sense they are trained for that specific mission to build a bridge or roads, not to fight, because building a bridge or a road means to build a bridge or a road. These obviously military engineers, assault engineers are armed fighting troops, but still what they do in that specific action is different from the fighting that they can even put up, but still it belongs to the tactical side of the story at that point. So a bridge can be built even by a civilian engineer. It doesn't make a difference. It's not required a military capability in this sense. And Von Clausewitz writes, these are only conditions. Under many circumstances they are in very connection and may almost identify themselves with the troops, as in building a bridge in a presence of the enemy, but in themselves they are always activity of the theory which does not form part of the theory of the conduct of war. I think I repeated it, but it's still important to stress. Okay, so next time we will continue on and finish and we will talk about else. Alright, so for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.